Britain was in its third year of involvement in the war and had survived all German attempts at subjugation through massive bombing of our citizen towns during the Blitz of 1940-41. The French were trodden under, and the Allied forces had withdrawn from their shores. Hitler had treacherously hurled himself on Russia. In the United States of America, life proceeded much as usual. The Americans had devised the extraordinary assistance called Lend-Lease, and this was their unselfish but purely financial contribution, but an act that helped greatly to increase British fighting power. To the citizens of the USA, the war in Europe seemed a long way off, not really their problem. That is until the fateful morning of December 7th, 1941, when, without warning, Japanese planes bombed Manila and Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu, events that were to turn the European conflict into World War II. Pearl Harbor had been dredged out of the coral reefs by the Americans after their annexation of the islands in 1888. It had become a U.S. naval base in 1918 and was, by 1941, the headquarters of 2/3 of the major fighting ships of the Pacific Fleet. In the late 30s and early 40s, Japan's military leaders wanted to establish a new order in the East. They meant to bring together under one roof the 8 corners of the earth, and they meant that one roof to be Japanese. They intended to extend the borders of their empire to the south, which meant that they had to attack and occupy Dutch, British, and American territories in Southeast Asia. To accomplish this without American interference, they had to put the United States fleet out of action. Japanese studies had shown that waters north of Hawaii were windswept and treacherous, and were consequently fairly free of surveillance. Admiral Yamamoto surmised that his fleet would probably escape detection by taking this northern route. A Japanese harbor with similar characteristics was used as a practice area, and Japanese pilots flying from their carriers trained on low-level bombing runs with dummy torpedoes. This intensive training proved invaluable and showed up many problems. Pearl Harbor's narrow channels and shallow water meant that standard Japanese torpedoes would dive to the bottom, so they had to be modified with extra wooden fins to prevent them diving so deeply. They also needed a much shorter period for arming the warheads. The task force rendezvoused at Takin Bay on an island north of Hawaii and set course down the treacherous, wind-swept northern passage on November 26th. Admiral Yamamoto was counting on the December winds carrying rain clouds before them, clouds that would provide excellent cover for any approaching plane. The preparatory signal had just been hoisted for the 8 o'clock colors at Pearl Harbor. It was 7:55 a.m. And at that moment, dive bombers appeared over Ford Island, and within a few seconds, torpedo planes came roaring up on Battleship Row. The commander of Patrol Wing 2 quickly sent out this message. Air raid, Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. A few minutes later, a similar message was sent out by the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. The major damage was done by the first attack of 12 planes, which came in from the southeast. The Nevada, West Virginia, Oklahoma, and California were hit hard by torpedoes. They were berthed down the southeast side of Ford Island. The Oklahoma was hit by 3 more torpedoes in the second attack and started to list heavily to port. A high-level bomber dropped a 1,000-pound armor-piercing shell on the Arizona. This, together with the previous strikes by 5 torpedoes, proved fatal. The Arizona's powder magazine soon exploded, and the shock waves actually knocked men off the neighboring ships Vestal and Nevada. The giant ship went to the bottom in just under 9 minutes. The West Virginia took 2 heavy bomb hits. and like the California had to be abandoned. During Phase 1, all outboard battleships had been hit by one or more torpedoes and one or more bombs, some of these being 15-inch converted shells. Phase 1 was followed by 3 other bombing runs, lasting until well after 9 a.m. Countless acts of bravery were enacted that day, and many are the stories that will live on in people's minds. The crew of an oiler, aware of the consequences if the ship was struck with her cargo, took her from her berth and headed well away, even though they knew that the ship's movement would attract the attention of enemy aircraft. Phase 5 was over, and the fury of the attacks was spent. 324 of the planes returned to their carriers, 29 were lost, and at 1:30 p.m., the task force headed for home. Their deed was done. In that short period of time, the official U.S. Navy report tells that 2,409 people were killed, 1,178 wounded. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, only 6 months later, 4 of the Japanese carriers were destroyed. Although most of the wreckage of the stricken ships has long since been cleared from the harbor, there remains one lasting reminder: the ruin of the Arizona. A sailor passing by on a ship would possibly remember a comrade on the Arizona and give a brief hand salute, or a ship's captain would render honors as other ships had done before the war, when the Arizona was in commission and flying her colors proudly. In 1950, a temporary platform was built above the Arizona's main deckhouse, and in March of that year, the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Arthur Radford, made it official, and from that day to this, the U.S. flag has flown proudly above the wreck of the Arizona. In 1956, Congress authorized the construction of the Arizona Memorial. The shrine room wall commemorates the 1,100 gallant men who gave their lives on that December day in 1941. The low part of the structure represents the initial defeat on December the 7th. The ends, sweeping up higher than the middle, represent victory. The plaque under the flagpole reads, "Dedicated to the eternal memory of our gallant shipmates in the USS Arizona, who gave their lives in action December 7th, 1941. About an hour after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Saipan-based Japanese bombers launched the first in a series of raids on the Pacific island of Guam. The garrison had no artillery, only a few .3 caliber machine guns and various small arms. For 2 days, the Japanese bombed and strafed the island and its defenders, and then naval landing parties and a Japanese army unit known as the South Seas Detachment made a combined assault. The island's governor, Captain George J. McMillan, realized that his tiny command was no match for the invasion force and began to surrender his post and the island. This was the picture of several dozen similar campaigns in many parts of the South Pacific. Between 1942 and 1945, the American forces struck back The task was not easy. Island by island, territory was regained. Air and naval barrages, followed by amphibious landings, led to hard jungle fighting against well-entrenched Japanese forces. On the morning of July 21st, 1944, after one of the longest and heaviest pre-assault naval bombardments of the war, the American recapture of Guam began. By the day's end, despite stiff resistance by the island's 18,500 Japanese defenders, 2 beaches had been secured. 3 weeks of bitter fighting followed before the island was once again in American hands. The recapture of Guam cost more than 7,000 American and about 17,500 Japanese casualties. The conflict raged on in almost every corner of the world. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was all but over, and on May the 1st, the news came through: Hitler is dead. VE Day was celebrated on May 7th amidst much rejoicing, but lives were still being sacrificed in the Far East. Meanwhile, the devastating attack on Japan had continued from the air and the sea. One by one, the big ships were picked out, and by the end of July 1945, the Japanese Navy had virtually ceased to exist. The homeland was in chaos and on the verge of collapse, but power still lay almost entirely in the hands of a military clique determined to commit the nation to mass suicide rather than accept defeat. Meanwhile, in New Mexico, American scientists had arrived at the culmination of their years of research and experimentation. And on July 17th, a piece of paper was placed in Winston Churchill's hand, on which was written, "Babies satisfactorily born." "It means," Churchill said to his colleagues, "that the experiment in the New Mexican desert has come off. The atomic bomb is a reality." Consultation between Churchill and President Roosevelt took place immediately. Eventually, agreement between the Allies was reached, and on July 26th, a 13-clause ultimatum was sent, calling for an immediate, unconditional surrender of the armed forces of Japan. The terms were rejected by the military rulers of Japan, and the United States Air Force made its plans accordingly to drop 1 atomic bomb on Hiroshima and 1 on Nagasaki. It was agreed to give every chance to the inhabitants. In order to minimize the loss of life, 11 Japanese cities were warned by leaflets on July 27th that they would be subjected to intensive air bombardment. Next day, 6 of them were attacked. 12 more were warned on July 31st, and 4 were bombed on August the 1st. The last warning was given on August the 5th. By then, the superfortresses claimed to have dropped 1.5 million leaflets every day and 3 million copies of the ultimatum. 10 days earlier, on July 25th, Britain was going to the polls. After steering the nation to the brink of victory in the greatest war of all time, the helmsman was voted out of office. Winston Spencer Churchill was overthrown, and the socialists came to power. August the 6th, 1945, the people of the city of Hiroshima on the southern coast of Japan's Honshu Island were setting out about their daily work. Children were already at school. Morning exercises were in full swing. The morning was sunny and pleasantly warm. The sound of aircraft approaching high overhead attracted some attention. Exactly at 8:15, a giant, pallid glow flashed through the skies like a bolt from the blue. In the following moments there came a roaring sound, followed by violent vibrations across an area of 10 miles or more. Powerful bombshell blasts terrible heat waves and furious radiation rays spread all over the place. Scenic Hiroshima, embracing a population of 400,000 people and 7 rivers that ran through the city, were gone at the dropping of the bomb, reducing the once flourishing regional army headquarters to ashes and leaving scorched land barren of plants and buildings. The horror-stricken survivors around the blast center had not the slightest idea of the nature of the bomb, much less how the flash and roaring noise occurred and where the bombshell blast and heat came from. It goes without saying that they also knew nothing about the horror of the radioactive rays. The bomb, dropped from a B-29 superfortress, had been detonated some 570 meters above Hiroshima. Its epicenter was immediately above the Hiroshima Industry Promotion Hall. The misery that an atomic bomb has inflicted upon mankind has yet to be adequately evaluated. Mr. Kazuyuki Seiki was a young boy of 8 at the time of the bombing, and he actually witnessed the blast from just outside the lethal area. He still suffers from radiation illness, necessitating frequent hospital treatment. Hiroshima declared itself as Peace City on August 6, 1949, to perpetuate the tragic memory in the hearts of the peoples of the world. Peace Memorial Park was built on the site, along with a monument for the bomb victims, a museum housing atom bomb materials, and Peace Memorial Hall. Defying all predictions, 50 years later on, a bombed Sultan's parasol tree bursts into life, and 2 sturdy trunks near the destroyed Hiroshima castle survived the conflagration. Full-sized models of the atomic bombs are on view in the museum. The smaller one, nicknamed Little Boy, represents the Hiroshima uranium bomb, and the larger one, Fat Man, is the one containing plutonium. This, having about twice the explosive power, was detonated over the city of Nagasaki 3 days later. And so the war against Japan came to an abrupt end, with horrific consequences. Whether the appalling loss of life, the awful suffering for those left to a slow and painful lingering death was justified, is even now a matter for conjecture. It was claimed that far more suffering and death would have resulted if the war had progressed for months ahead using conventional weapons. Would the Japanese leaders have carried out their threat to commit mass suicide? We'll never know. Current policy in Japan is certainly to keep the event alive in the minds of all its citizens. Such a tragedy must not be allowed to reoccur. Parties of school children are in constant view, wandering round the Peace Park and taking part in various acts of reverence for their fallen ancestors. There is no real victor in any war. When will the peoples of our world realize this fact and learn to live in peace and harmony with one another?